About a year or so ago, I made a video about the somewhat contentious topic of separating art from the artist. I'll link it in the top right corner and the description, but it is what it says on the tin, exploring the idea of separating art from artist, particularly in instances where said artist is a bit of a prick. We looked at people like John Lennon, J.K. Rowling, H.P. Lovecraft, and Kanye West. Yay. Oh god, what the hell happened, man?
This video is kinda similar to that in that today I'll be showing you and talking about art done by obviously flawed people, but there are some key differences. I'm gonna focus exclusively on albums since it was listening to certain ones that sparked my interest in this topic in the first place and made me notice this genre, we'll call it. Another important caveat, I'm going to be talking about some pretty bad people, or at least people who have objectively done some pretty bad stuff. However, the intent isn't necessarily to simply vilify them. Rather, what sparked me to make this video was an interest in how these individuals talk about themselves and their flaws through their music. I should specify, not everyone I'm going to talk about is the Antichrist. Indeed, I think most are just people who have decided to use their music to explore their very real vices, sins, and pains. That's about it. I haven't really got any kind of thesis at the time of writing. Maybe I'll find one as I go along. So why don't we just hop in and get the big one out the way first.
When you hear about slavery for 400 years, that sounds like a choice. Like,
I ain't got much to say about Kanye's current antics, except for maybe a very, very reluctant I told you so.
I was actually making a video of me going through all his albums for the first time. Don't know if I'll ever finish it at this point, but the album I actually started with was the 2018 album, Yay, which is also the album I'll be discussing first today.
Produced in the wake of then just the latest of Kanye's controversies, in this case, a TMZ interview where he essentially blames slaves for slavery. Ye can be seen as a snapshot of the mind of Kanye West in that moment, the issues in his life he was dealing with, and the thoughts and emotions clouding him, influenced by his bipolar disorder. This album being the first confirmation of his affliction with it, and how much it affects his life. The album cover itself bearing the phrase, "I hate being bipolar, it's awesome."
The relevance of this phrase is made apparent with the opening track, I Thought About Killing You, which acts as a kind of tone setter of sorts, establishing the mood and the focus of the album. It begins with a long spoken word section, with Kanye saying things like the most beautiful thoughts are always besides the darkest, and I love myself way more than I love you, and I think about killing myself, meaning you can bet he thought about killing you. This intro colours the entirety of the album. All Mine, in any other context, would have just been a fairly shallow, if somewhat absurd rap song about sex, just like a million other shallow, somewhat absurd rap songs about sex. But when taken into the context set up by I Thought About Killing You, All Mine feels like Kanye in the midst of a kind of delusional high, reveling in wanton sex and drugs, spending vast sums of money, ridiculous lines like, "Let me hit it..." "Let me hit it raw like fuck the outcome. None of us would be here without cum." Show the recklessness he allows himself to get up to during these spells of grandeur. On the other hand, you have Yikes, which is very much the low to All Mine's high. Here, Kanye talks about abusing drugs, almost to the point of overdosing, flipping between emotions like a coin flipping in the air. He searches for help as everything around him twists and becomes frightening, to the point that he starts to become fearful of himself. Other songs on the album reflect this, like Ghost Town, where Kid Cudi on the hook talks about wanting to be loved, but all his actions only pushing the people he wants to love further and further away, which, in hindsight, can only be taken as prophetic for Kanye. Cudi himself being one of those people he would lose. Even taking into account Kanye's unfortunate circumstances, there is some regressive shit on this project that I think needs to be called out, like the aforementioned Yikes, where, in the midst of the Me Too movement, Kanye signals his support for Russell Simmons, who's been accused of sexual misconduct and assault by over a dozen women. There's also Violent Crimes, the closing track, which I'm somewhat torn on. Kanye details how his attitude towards women has changed since having daughters, and while it is nice he no longer sees women in the same objectifying light he used to, and it does act as an interesting exploration of how perspective changes, the whole song does come across as very paternalistic, some might even say patriarchal. I have seen some people say the song is being self-aware about this contradiction. I don't know, maybe I'm just coloured by later Kanye's actions a bit. Regardless, I think this album does a good job of doing what it sets out to do, and that is act as a kind of snapshot of the mind of Kanye West in the moment of its release. That's ultimately the best way to describe it, an imprint of a human mind. Which is also something I'd say about the next album I'll be talking about.
You wanted to know where I've been? Now you'll find out.
Hypochondriac is the album that made me interested in making this video in the first place. The second album by musician Randall Fendel, Brakence, Hypochondriac is, as I interpret it, a reflection of Brakence's struggle with ego and anxiety as a young person growing up under the spotlight of internet fame.
Like with Ye, Hypochondriac really feels like stepping into someone else's mind, and I found listening to it a very thought-provoking experience. If you want to get a sense for it, just listen to the song 5G, which is very much a microcosm of the whole project.
In the song, Brakence sequesters himself, telling people to stay away from his issues, coping instead through drugs and social media, pointing out how modern man's addiction to technology is destroying us and the planet, only to admit that he himself is also profiting off this system that causes so many people, including himself, so much suffering. We also get lines alluding to his complex relationship with his ego.
I'm especially drawn to the pre-chorus, always putting myself above you to feel important, no I'm never gonna take that dub, I can't be rewarded, go re-record it. I've seen some people express criticism towards this album's lyrical content, and while I'm not gonna defend something like fighting for my life like The Ring is Elden, I also think that characterizing this project as Brakence just unironically sucking himself off is, and I don't like to use language like this, a kind of bad faith misreading of the album.
Take the song Caffeine for instance, which is kind of like this album's version of All Mine. It's this arrogant, braggadocious, somewhat obnoxious ego trip, and yeah, that's exactly what it is. After suddenly blowing up, suddenly having all these eyes on him, he's overwhelmed by success and loses himself in it, going mad from the power, but even in isolation, this track shows fractures in the posturing. The latter half alludes to the pressure caused by his newfound fame, his self-admitted perfectionism creeping in as he's desperate to see any kind of progression in his skill.
In the chorus, he says he doesn't do this for the audience, but in the final refrain, he chops his vocals to remove the don't. He does this for the audience. These cracks in the facade are explored further in Teeth. Take a breath before my ego pop, play a set like I'm a handmade prop, put the clay in my oven and petrify, suffer restrain it, that's fear-based art. Brakence has begun to see his worth tied to his musical success. He keeps at it, keeps going through the motions in order to avoid a fall.
This theme of his ego growing in correlation to his anxiety keeps coming up. Songs like Intellectual Greed, which sees him grapple with the negative consequences of fame. CBD, where he explores suicidal inclinations and how he feels no one really cares about him, possibly having driven them away himself, something seemingly confirmed by Argyle. He says he doesn't want support, doesn't want a partner, trying to project the same air of confidence he did on caffeine, but now it's hollow, and in the end, he has to admit that all he wants is death.
And then we have the song Deepfake, which really feels like the record's climax in that this is where brakence seemingly finally drops the act. He drops his ego and openly talks about his issues without getting defensive, giving as true an image as possible of the depth of his issues and how much pain he's in. After telling those who wanted to help him to fuck off, brakence is now stalking their Twitter, regretting their absence but still hoping they're doing okay. After the whole album, it's honestly such a cathartic listen. The LP ends with the title track, a mournful ballad where brakence, Randy, regrets how his inability to be honest and deal with his problems have cost him not only his health, but his relationship, one he can't move on from. Unable to find love with any other man, he repeats the refrain heard throughout the album. A hypochondriac, I think of you, blood pressure spikes. I'll have a heart attack. The things I do to see you smile. There's more I could go on about, but I do genuinely want to encourage you to listen to it for yourself. Even without the lyrics, Randy's vocals and production are genuinely impressive and deserve to be heard. To end this section, I'll just say that Hypochondriac, despite brakence perhaps still needing to work on his writing style, is a really compelling and touching portrait of mental health in a digital age, and I think a lot of people, especially around the same age as Randy and myself, will get plenty out of this. Very good things to say about this record, obviously. Perhaps ironic for an album occasionally derided for its egoism, but I liked it. And while I do have my issues with it, my feelings towards Ye are also largely positive. The album, not the man. Let's not talk about him right now. But given that we are talking about people talking about their flaws, I suppose it was only a matter of time before we ran into muddier waters.
I love you. Thank you for listening. Enjoy.
Now, how do I introduce someone like xxxtentacion? In the 2010s, he was one of the flag bearers for a new wave of hip-hop that began on SoundCloud, one that was more lo-fi and DIY, pulling inspirations from folk, emo, rock and indie, lyrically often focusing on darker topics related to mental health, like depression, addiction, anxiety and loneliness. While it was alive, X was arguably at the forefront of this new style, partly due to the ridiculous popularity of his music, and also the very public legal issues he would deal with throughout his career, most of a violent and domestic variety.
No matter how you slice it, X, Onfree, was someone with issues, big issues, which he was famous for openly exploring in his work, something which endeared him to many people going through similar turmoil. But unlike our previous two albums, we actually have instances of those issues causing him to seriously hurt people at the time he was making said work, and given how deeply personal his music is, there's no serious suggestion of any separation of art from artist. So how does that affect things? Are his words powerful enough to ring true, or does artist overshadow art? This one's going to be slightly different in that I'll be broadly talking about two albums, 17 and Question Mark, X's first and second albums respectively. I was considering talking about his posthumous ones, but after listening to Skins, I don't think they'll really add much to the discussion that we can't get from the first two. If you really want to know my thoughts on it, save yourself 20 minutes and just listen to Train Food. It's about the only song really worth listening to. I've described both Ye and Hypochondriac as stepping into someone else's mind, but here I don't have to do that because that's literally what X calls his albums at the start of them. So what's inside of his? A lot of depression, suicidal thoughts, and a fair bit of anger.
One thing that stood out to me about X's music is the focus on other people, and not that the previous albums didn't delve into this topic, but X's relationship to the people in his life is very much a big part of his music. Take the opener to 17, Jocelyn Flores, named after a friend of his who took her own life, and feels like it was written from a place of understanding.
Following that is Depression and Obsession, where X, in the middle of deep depression, finds himself seeking the physical comfort of a partner, hooking up on hills and at motels. Similar emotions can be found on Sad, which sees X begging his partner not to leave them. Then there's Save Me, which is a look into isolation, X wailing, "Who do I have? Does anyone here want to be my friend?" begging for someone to save him before his fall. Alone Part 3 also deals with this topic, X asking who he can rely on when the going gets tough, how the failed relationships he's had have only jaded him and made him wonder if he's better off dying alone. However, I do find there are a few questionable elements to be found, sometimes in the same songs.
Sad, for instance, though it is catchy as hell, does read as quite manipulative, especially with lines like "suicide if you ever try to let go." On top of that, there are multiple songs, especially on 17, which directly allude to his relationship with ex Geneva Ayla, who accused him of assault in 2016, crimes to which he admitted in a recording.
You also have Revenge, which was already an ominous song, but with the knowledge of what he's done, some of the lyrics are downright disturbing. Some kill, some steal, some break your heart, and you thought I would let it go and let you walk? Well, broken hearts break bones, so break up fast, and I don't want to let it go, so in my grave I'll rot. I've dug 2 graves for us, my dear. What do you even want for me to say? I'm sure some people are going to argue that the story of X is one of redemption, second chances and forgiveness, and these things do come up in his music.
There are songs where X explores feelings of remorse and regret like Pain Equal Best Friend, as well as wanting to change and become a better person on Before I Close My Eyes. I still, however, have my issues with this narrative.
Namely, X often talks about Ayla in particular as if she is largely responsible for the problems in their relationship, while ignoring his rather significant contributions. He does express vague feelings of regret, but often doesn't really acknowledge what it is he's feeling regret for, and when he does, it's usually on the edgier cuts like the aforementioned Revenge. When I listen to X's music, ultimately the emotion I always come back to is confliction. As someone both around X's age when he died and having gone through similar periods of mental anguish myself, I feel a natural inclination to sympathize with his words, to not invalidate the emotional pain he's clearly feeling. But in the back of my head, I can't get rid of the things he's done, especially when I'm hearing what I think is a shifting of the blame at times.
By the time Ye came out, the worst Kanye had done up to that point was ruin an award show and say things that were, offensive, but also stupid and sad in a way that made me feel more sorry for him than angry at him. And as far as I know, brakence hasn't done anything much worse than be a bit egotistical sometimes, something he seems to be very much aware of anyway.
But with X, we know he really did hurt people, and part of stepping into his mind involved seeing his mentality as he did so, and at the time of writing many of these songs, it didn't seem like he had really grown out of said mentality. But did he ever?
I think there is evidence to suggest he was headed in that direction. Question Mark in particular has a couple remorseful cuts on it, and the music video for Sad features X beating up a younger version of himself as a dark-robed figure tells him his own worst enemy is himself, demanding he now live a life of love. Ultimately though, I don't think we'll ever really know because he died before we could see any long-term change.
So now I'm kind of left in like this really awkward liminal space where it's unclear what to really take from his music, and I think that's okay. People, even the best and even the worst, are complicated, and seeing their different sides can be a confusing, if not uncomfortable experience when you're unsure of what to even think of them. X did horrible things in his life, and all the trauma and pain he experienced don't even begin to justify it. But what it did do was allow him to reach out to a lot of other people hurting like him, and they, no doubt, appreciated his presence greatly. So yeah, very inconclusive, but hey, that kind of comes with the territory. Personally, I can't see myself listening to X's music much in my spare time, even if I do actually enjoy it a fair bit, but if you do, whatever, he's dead anyway, so it's not like you're supporting someone bad and alive.
Before we move on to our final album of the video, a brief intermission.
Say the line, bud.
So I know I said the next video would be the bag of milk one.
Yay! Yippee!
So I know I said the next video would be the bag of milk one, but shit happens. The delay is mostly down to two factors. One, the scripting is just taking longer than I estimated, and I really want to get it right and not rush it out. It should be the next one though. Should. Two is actually kind of appropriate given the topic of this video, but I've been making music. Those of you who followed me for a while or have even just been paying attention to the songs I've been using in this video know that I make music, and the past couple of months I've decided to take it a bit more seriously. This has culminated in the release of what I'm going to call my first major single, the songs Void Prelude and 2MASSW J12073346-3932539. These songs themselves are a teaser for my upcoming album titled The Universe is a God-Shaped Hole. It's an album themed around cosmicism, existentialism, and just a bit of slightly cheesy horror. I'm dipping my toes into drone, noise, ambience, rap. I'm doing stuff I've never done before, and it's been a really fun process. The album itself won't be out for a good few months, but until then you can listen to Void Prelude and 2MASSW J12073346-3932539 pretty much wherever. If you want updates about the album or my videos, then the best place to find them is on my Patreon, where you can also get stuff like credits in my videos, early access to music and more. But with that being said, let's get back to the video.
If there's one thing uniting the projects I've talked about so far, it's their depressing or at least negative aura. It's hard to see Ye as anything other than a kind of dark premonition. Hypochondriac is, I find, an ultimately incredibly sad and melancholic record. And while X does try and end his LPs on positive notes, for reasons I've just described, I don't think he entirely succeeds.
But I do want to end this on something more, and there is one album I can think of that is definitely more.
You texted me at 2 o'clock in the morning. I feel like I'm fallen. Why do you feel that way?
Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers is the fifth studio album by Kendrick Lamar, arguably the most acclaimed hip-hop artist alive today.
Released 5 years after his previous LP Damn, I consider Mr. Morale almost the continuation of its predecessor.
After the massive and political To Pimp a Butterfly, Damn was a much more personal and intimate project. Despite it arguably being his most mainstream in terms of sound, I'm tempted to call it Kendrick's darkest album, emotionally at least. Releasing at arguably his commercial peak, Damn sees Kendrick exploring the pain found both in his present life and his past. Feel sees him grappling with a sense of isolation, of no one truly wanting the best for him, not really seeing him as Kendrick. I feel the whole world want me to pray for him, but who the fuck praying for me? Lust alludes to a growing feeling of monotony, as well as hinting at the sex addiction he would go on to tackle in more detail later. And Pride details Kendrick's worries and fears at ages 7, 17, and 27. And by the end of the album, it doesn't really feel like Kendrick has conquered these demons of his. Instead, the final song, Duckworth, rewinds through the entire record, all the way back to the first track, only to start all over again, endlessly looping, until Mr. Morales. No, wait, Morale, fuck.
Right now. The baby, we'll see what happens.
The LP is split into 2 discs, Mr. Morale and The Big Steppers respectively. It feels wrong to call Mr. Morale the lighter half of the record, but it serves to introduce us to Kendrick, to get us up to speed with where he's at and what's going on in his life, with the first track, United in Grief, informing us that he's been going through shit, all the way from Damn to now. The track talks about using money, materialism and sex as a form of coping and grieving, something that comes up a lot on this disc.
The following N95 strips the listener of all their extremities. Money, jewels, the internet, literally telling them to go out and touch grass. And once all that's gone, all that's left is you. And you are ugly as fuck. His words, not mine. Kendrick is talking to shallow flexes and fake woke black screen activists on this track. But given the detailing of his own struggles with materialism, I get the idea he might be talking about himself as well, like he does on the following Worldwide Steppers.
Here Kendrick talks about his family, dancing to Baby Shark with his daughter while keeping watch for actual sharks. He mentions the 2-year writer's block that's partially responsible for the long hiatus, as well as his infidelity fueled by his sexual addictions. The second verse then details his glimpsing of a better world, the world of the rich and famous, the world of the privileged. His access to is seemingly measured by his growing ability to get with white women. When questioned about this by his partner Whitney, he excuses it by claiming it to be a kind of perverse form of reparations.
Then we have verse 3, which, in addition to taking shots at the internet and cancel culture, also feels like a dig at capitalism in general. He talks about non-profits, corporations and Hollywood infiltrating schools, the media, how black people, more likely to be disenfranchised by the system, are forced down a funnel that either ends with them in prison or dead, and those who just passively participate in the system ultimately share the burden of its consequence as well, which does include Kendrick.
The next song, Die Hard, I initially thought was an odd follow-up. Given the sudden positive shift in lyrics about changing for the better, making up for past wrongs and wanting to be accepted, on a different album it might have been the closer. But now I think I understand that it's meant to be more of a shift for Kendrick going forward, now being more open and willing to discuss his personal issues. Indeed, the very next song, Father Time, sees Whitney encouraging Kendrick to go to therapy, much to his annoyance.
Despite that, from this point on, Kendrick begins using the songs almost as therapy sessions, delving into his childhood and his personal insecurities and flaws, such as on Father Time, where he details how his father's stoic, distant parentage affected how he turned out as an adult, hiding his emotion, never really opening up to anyone, and seeing competition where there probably isn't any. He ends the song imploring his male listeners to not pass their daddy issues on to their children, as well as not burden the women in their lives with the weight of their own problems, just because they're too proud to actually get help, as Kendrick was. I think this is what the infamous We Cry Together is about.
Los. Listen. Hum me the fucking melody to that song if it's so fucking catchy. don't know it.
The song follows a couple having a very intense argument, and while I wouldn't call this a formal debate by any stretch of the word, I'd say Tyler Page is winning.
Talking about how women are often collateral damage of the traumatic cycle that men find themselves in, citing Harvey Weinstein and R. Kelly, and Kendrick has no real response other than, well, you still listen to his music. Which is funny because he once threatened to take his music off Spotify when they said they were going to stop promoting the music of people like R. Kelly and xxxtentacion actually.
We'll actually be talking about R. Kelly more in a minute as we move on to the second disc, which sees Kendrick continue his journey of introspection as he starts therapy, Whitney noting on the intro to Count Me Out that he seems close to a breakthrough.
Indeed, on this track, Kendrick grows tired and weary of fame, realizing it's impossible for someone, even of such universal acclaim as he is, to please everyone, preferring when people count him out, give up on him and stop holding him to this atmospheric standard, and this message is ultimately the heart of the record, doubled down on in the following song, Crown.
Kendrick wants the listener to grow out of celebrity culture, to stop looking at stars as saviors and idols that are to be emulated and will deliver us to a better tomorrow.
This is reflected in the song Savior, where Kendrick lists several prominent black celebrities, including himself, noting that despite the gifts and the joys they have given to the world, none of them are its savior.
I think this is why Kendrick not only mentions R. Kelly a couple of times, but also features Kodak Black several times on the record, most noticeably on Rich Interlude and Silent Hill.
Kodak Black, for those who don't know, was a rapper who's gotten himself embroiled in a whole bunch of bad legal and probably moral issues, and all around just seems like a fucking arsehole.
I think Kendrick's reasoning for mentioning and featuring these artists so prominently is so he can draw a parallel between them and himself. Not necessarily because he's done things on an equally terrible level as them, but so he can point out all three came from the same root. Wondering if R. Kelly would have turned out as he did if he hadn't been molested on Mr. Morale, referring to himself as not pro-black but Kodak Black on Savior. This is all part of Kendrick's efforts to not only demystify and humanize himself through drawing attention to his flaws, but also get people to recognize the larger systems and cycles at work that foster and perpetuate people like Kodak Black and R. Kelly, a point he makes sure to emphasize on Mr. Morale. I'm sure he'd make the same point about someone like xxxtentacion.
I won't dwell too long on Auntie Diary since I made a video about that song when the album dropped last year, and I more or less stand by everything I said in that video, so if you want to know my thoughts on that in isolation, I've linked it in the description and in the top right corner, go check it out. What I will say about the song's place in the wider album, it really does feed into the record's themes of acknowledging where one is flawed, working to do better, and doing one's best to try and rebel against the cultures and institutions that are truly responsible for suffering. Given how important Kendrick's faith is to him, I think the line, "The day I chose humanity over religion," is an especially powerful one, coming from him, and puts us in the right emotional and mental space as we head into the finale of the album.
Mother I Sober is a lot to undersell it.
In many ways, it is the album's climax, with Kendrick's problems, his family's problems, and society's problems all coming to a head. The source of Kendrick's lust addiction is implied to be related to his mother's constant questioning of him as a child if his cousin molested him. That never happened, but the reason she asked so much was because of fear, because she was worried that he would go through the same thing she did.
Sexual abuse is often an underreported epidemic in black communities, with the reasons going back all the way to the horrors of slavery. Numerous rappers like Denzel Curry and Lil Wayne have revealed they've been sexually abused as children, as well as many more as suggested by Kendrick, who use their often criticized materialism as a means of avoiding their trauma, like Kendrick indulging in sex to avoid his.
His voice growing louder, Kendrick proclaims his freedom over his guilt from his mother's suffering, frees his mother from the shame she felt, frees black children from their parents' pain, encouraging abusers to see transformation, and hoping our bodies stay sacred. The song ends with Whitney congratulating him for breaking a generational curse, followed by his daughter Uzi thanking her family. The final track, Mirror, is, as YouTuber Pathway put it, the song that plays over the credits at the end of the film. Having finally realised what's really important to him, he abandons his saviour complex, shrugs off people's expectations of him, the responsibilities he and others put on his shoulder, ending the song, the album, and really this phase of his life with the words, "I choose me, I'm sorry."
Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers is a lot to process if the fact that this section of the video is the longest by far doesn't clue you in. Its ultimate purpose is to demystify a living legend, to make us question why we ever saw him like that in the first place, when he was just as human, just as flawed as the rest of us. And flawed he is. There is stuff Kendrick says on this album that I do question. As much as I do agree with his message of not expecting people to be perfect, I think the decision to involve Kodak Black so closely with the record is a step too close to sweeping his transgressions under the rug. And it does make his earlier swipes at cancel culture feel a little, I don't know, obnoxious. It reminds me of Kanye featuring Marilyn Manson and DaBaby on Donda, which I also found tasteless. He also skirts a little too close to some anti-vax talking points for my liking at times, though I do think there's surrounding context to these bars that makes them make a little more sense, in context. But at the same time, these misgivings almost feed back into the central mission of the album, which is to humanize the greatest rapper alive by letting us know man's just a guy at the end of the day. A guy with some skill, but no less flawless than me or you. In fact, we see him struggle with some real fucking issues on this thing. And I think the call to apply this anti-worship message to not just Kendrick, but all of celebrity culture is an important one, now more than ever.
We may enjoy these people's work, but we mustn't deify them, lose sight of their humanity for their benefit and ours. This record might not be flawless, but it is undoubtedly human, and that's maybe the best compliment you can give something like this.
The past couple of years, one thing I've started to appreciate is the value of things designed to provoke unpleasant emotion. Fear, melancholy, pain, anger, hate, grief. All of these emotions are as valid a part of our existence as happiness, contentment, love, and as such they deserve to be explored through art as much as any other part of the human condition. Until now, most of my avenues for exploring these kinds of emotions have been through films, books, TV, games, but now I'm realizing many of these same emotions can also be found in music. In fact, one might argue that music is better equipped to convey these kinds of emotions than most forms of fiction, in some ways at least. It's hard to think of many other artistic mediums where artists are so often allowed to be this direct, this blunt. No need for characters or plots that can be used as avenues for themes and allegories. Any characters that do exist on Ye, Hypochondriac, 17 and Question Mark, and Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers only exist as explicit representations, parts, avatars of the people making them. It's one thing to watch a film about grief, to watch fictional characters mourning other fictional characters that are meant to be a reflection on how we grieve.
It's a whole other thing to listen to Phil Elverum, noted real person, detail his real grieving process after the actual death of his real wife.
For me, my favourite albums are those that make me feel like I'm looking into a crack in a person's head and getting a little glimpse at what they are. It doesn't always have to be revealing personal information about their life. I just need to get the sense that the music is conveying something they found important, that what I'm hearing meant something to them.
And I think that's why I keep coming back to these albums in particular, why, despite my criticisms of some of them, they also kind of capture me. There's just this kind of, maybe not necessarily honesty, but a sort of rawness that makes it hard for me to look away, that almost in turn provokes a response from me. And said response, as we've seen, doesn't always have to be positive. Sometimes it can be, sometimes it's negative, and sometimes it's somewhere in the middle. Wherever the case, whatever my feelings, I was emotionally engaged, and whatever else you can say about these albums, I think that's worth something. In the process of listening and re-listening to these albums, I think I've come to the conclusion that not only is it good, but probably for the best that flawed, real people make music.
Like I mentioned, I enjoy the process of getting to know people through their music, but these albums have been an important reminder that you never have to wholeheartedly and uncritically feel the same towards these creators. And this can apply to artists and celebrities everywhere. To hold them up as somehow special people, unique role models and leaders is wrong, because they are in no way that matters, no more real than you, no more important or valuable than you, and certainly no less flawed.
And just so I'm clear, this isn't me saying we should let public figures and celebrities off the hook because at the end of the day they're just people. I think that people with the power, the money and the influence like those I've talked about should be held responsible, should be held to a higher standard. I'll be very disappointed if Kanye comes back one day with new music and people are just cool with it. But there's a difference between expecting someone to be a good human being and expecting someone to be more than a human being.
Art is ultimately a process of reflection, reflecting on the world, on the people around us and on ourselves, meaning that it, and by extension the people who make it, are not going to be perfect.
Most recognize that we, the self, is not perfect, so we really shouldn't be expecting that of the other.
Instead, what I think we should be expecting is reflection, introspection, improvement. I think that's not only going to lead to better art, but better individuals, and enough better individuals make a better society. Don't ask people to be perfect, ask them to be better.
Trying to change this attitude would, I think, require a real shift in our culture, both societally and economically. And let's be real, I'm not going to be the one to trigger that. I'm not even 100% sure of how I go about doing this, and to try and suggest otherwise would be kind of antithetical to the whole point of this. So in the end, I'll just give you some advice. Take it or leave it. Don't buy into celebrity worship. By all means, find talented artists that you admire, respect, support, and find inspiration from. Just be aware that they are as human as you. They go to bed, they cut their nails, they piss, they shit, they have their good days, they have their bad days. They've done things they regret, done things they might not. They've hurt people just as they've helped people. Never forget that. Never forget that they are human, with all the mess that comes with being human. But if you want to just ignore everything I've said the past, I don't know, half an hour, or however long this video ends up being, sure, stand away. I can try my best, but if there's anything I'm not, it's your savior. Oh, God. Oh, I can finally listen to normal music again. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Link to everything, my socials, Patreon, all that in the description below. As is my music. It's down there. Find it everywhere. Stream it if you want. And yeah, next video should be the milk one this time. Hold me to that. I don't think I have any other ideas that I could potentially use aside from that, so it'll kind of have to be that one. But yeah, hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, I'll see you soon. Bye bye.